Hi, my name is Stephen Pace. I'm a Senior Solution Architect at Magnitude, and this is a recording of a session that was originally done at our UK user conference back in June, and it was done by John Breitling from Teradata, and then later by myself in our Chicago user conference in July. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Teradata, they're one of our partners. They got their start in data warehousing. They sold very large hardware for building giant, very fast data warehouses, but in a sense has expanded into a lot of other areas. They have a large consulting organization that's experts in data warehousing and other technologies that they sell and service, as well as doing other solutions, cloud-based, you name it, they're probably in it. And they've got a lot of very happy customers all over the world, running some of the very largest data warehouses in the world. And you can buy the software and the hardware however you want. You can have an on-premise data warehouse all the way to running everything in the cloud. You can have hybrid implementations. And so they have a lot of solutions out there. So they tend to work with very large customers, huge banks, telcos, airlines, healthcare, major retailers, transportation companies, and so forth. I mean, they're running the largest data warehouses in the world for 1,400 customers in 77 countries. And what we're going to talk about today is the GDPR solution that we're a part of with Magnitude. So behind the scenes, some of the metadata that's being captured for this program is being stored in a database that's being essentially maintained by the Magnitude Data Warehouse Automation solution. But, we started the presentation with people in the room. Of course, we asked, who's familiar with GDPR, and almost everybody in the European session raised their hands and had GDPR programs, which makes sense because anybody that's got a customer in Europe, is really subject to this regulation. And indeed, we saw that when people raised their hands on the U.S. side, because if you have any customers in Europe or plan to have some in the future, you need to be aware of this legislation and be able to support some of the reporting requirements. And so, this is really where this system got developed, because originally, as part of this data asset valuation service, they were doing essentially lineage reporting, and from source all the way to consumption layer. And that's in part of GDPR. You need to understand where there's personally identifiable information in the systems, and lineage shows that. But GDPR goes a little bit further about not only understanding the lineage, but how is it being consumed, who's using it, how is it being transformed, how is it being stored downstream. So it's important legislation, as we talked about. I mean, the penalties are pretty huge if you don't comply. Between 2% or 4% of your turnover, or 10 million euros. So it's significant legislation. It's important to understand your systems and how to comply. This is difficult because what GDPR allows essentially customers to do is send you a request and say, tell me all the information you know about me. And that just by itself can be a huge challenge. It's not just good enough to just dump your CRM system and say, hey, here's all the information we have, because that information could be stored in tens or hundreds or maybe thousands of systems and databases and tables out there. So it's not just good enough knowing where it is if you don't know all the places that it is and all the places it's being used. And it's really difficult from a manual standpoint to profile every bit of data in the organization. And so one of the keys of how you can start cracking this problem is looking at metadata. And essentially metadata is the table names and the column names, field names, and the rules engines. And so if you can look at all the places that metadata is, you can certainly start developing signatures of what PII information is. Things like name and date of birth, and but potentially also inferring PII from data that's being read from PII columns, even if they're not named something that's somewhat close to something that you would think is PII. And so we'll look at this a little bit later with some of the reports that we'll show. But I think a key here is the more you can automate, the better off you are, because it's really up to you to prove that the person requesting the information isn't a customer. There is a right to be forgotten, and and people are looking at, well, should I encrypt some of this data? And so, if you need to know what data to encrypt. You need to know where it is. So it's a huge problem, and we're going to start looking at some of the issues around it. So what Teradata has done is created a solution that's aligned to how the regulators see the problem. And it starts with fixed bid assessment, 40 days to essentially collect that evidence in a non-invasive way, essentially pulling metadata from the system, so not needing to ingest any real data. And this is typically delivered in the cloud, although it could be also delivered on-premise. And it essentially ingests the metadata. They do analysis about what some of the PII, and they help you essentially create the initial report that you need, this DPIA, or Data Protection Impact Assessment. And there's some optional places where you can bring your own legal team in. Often the GDPR programs will be closely related to your internal legal system. So basically the project is aligned to collect the evidence, build the initial report, get some feedback from legal, and then start going into remediation process. So essentially, ingesting ongoing changes, because it's not good enough just to have a report. You need to actually say, maybe I'm targeting my high-profile areas or high-risk areas at first, but I'm going to start needing to add some of those other areas that maybe we're not aware that there's PII there. Maybe we don't think there is, but we need to actually verify that. And then any ongoing changes, we need to also bring those in. So they have a multi-phase process where they can do just the assessment, also have ongoing remediation, and then longer term, once you're up and running, you've got your initial DPIA out there, and it's already sent to GDPR. There's ongoing maintenance and process. And it's important to say that this is not just on Teradata solution, and this can be metadata across any type of database you have, any type of ETL tool, any type of BI tool. So really any type of metadata out there is designed to be able to ingest this data. So what are some of the steps involved in this? And again, I'm not going to read everything that's on the slide, but these steps have really come from what the regulator has asked about. And anything on this slide that's starred is things that this program can help automate. So just to look at a couple of them. So for instance, with people, which users are accessing the personal data? What applications are they using to do that? Or for finding the private data, generating a lineage to how that data got sourced, and then who's looking at it. And that's going to become more important as we look at some of the downstream reports developed out of the system. Many of the GDPR solutions out there really only look at one side of the process. So maybe how data is getting sourced, or maybe how people are looking at the data. Teradata is really looking at both sides of this. So if you're familiar with an ETL tool that might have a lineage package, that's really only looking at the information that ETL tool is touching, like maybe the jobs that are copying from one source system and landing it into a data warehouse. But you may have multiple ETL systems out there, and you may have multiple BI tools, and you might have other processes just manually copy data over there. So really how these things are intertwined is really the important bits. Who's using the data, and what are they using it for? Now, it's a little bit hard to see on this slide, but this is a real screenshot for how data is being sourced and how it's being processed, and kind of the initial way it's displayed to the user in the system. So, here you can see from mainframe ETL processes that are moving the data to a data warehouse, then a business object universe that's being pointed at that data warehouse, and then some business object reports that are running that people are using. But you have one portal, one place to go to look at all of that information. Now, on the consumer side, we need to know who's looking at this data, especially the PII data. Because if nobody's actually using it, would anybody even care? And the user accessing this, PII data, what are they doing with it? I mean, are they deleting some data? If so, is that a problem? Or if people are updating data that is never read, after that. If you can't find any processes consuming it, then what is that actually doing? It might be a redundant process. And, you're not really meant to be holding personal data. So if you see a process that's taking some data and storing it somewhere and it's never being used, the regulator doesn't like to see information like that. So it may give you some ideas or some hints about areas that you could maybe go delete out that process, or you don't need it anymore, or really start examining it a little bit more to find out what it's really doing. But if you're having somebody that's copying personal data into their own personal database and renaming it, maybe renaming it ABC instead of customer name, this process will catch it. Because if you just looked at a column that was named ABC, you wouldn't necessarily know that that's PII. But in this case, we can infer it from how it got sourced. Now, when John first went through his presentation, he started talking about, just the scale of some of these customers. And you can see very quickly, so this is a large global bank, and you can just see based on the scale that if you're going to manually process all of the data that you had out there, it really would be very difficult to do that in a manual way. So automation is key. Just look at this, 20,000 servers, 15,000 point-to-point integrations. It would just be a massive, massive effort to do this in a manual way. So you really have to have some type of automation. And, what some people have tried to do is they try to do, manual data surveys and give you a guess about, where this data is being held. The problem is, and especially the regulators are getting smarter, they say, well, that's not evidence. You're just telling us you've guessed that something is there, but you're not proving that in any way. But more importantly, even those types of manual surveys are extremely expensive. They divert staff away from what the things they should be doing. And I think that really the killer part of it is the second you generate the report, it's immediately out of date, right? New systems have come online, that things have been changed. And, you can't guarantee that this report that was so meticulously, crafted is still, going to meet the need of the regulators. The regulator says, well, what's changed in the last month since we've seen this? And if you don't know, then that can be a problem. So, when Teradata was first developing this program, they went into this large global bank, and they said, what you're saying sounds great. We're seeing the shortcomings of our current approach, but you know what? It's a difficult problem, and so we've already gone through. We spent 7 months, and we have created a manual document for 5 of the databases in use. And so the good news is we know the answer there. So to prove out your system, we want you to come in, use your automation, and then show us the answer that we already know. And so we'll see how good it is. If you did in 4 weeks what we did in 7 months, then, this is a win-win, and this is something we'd be interested in. So essentially, they went through the process, and, this metadata was ingested. And as the 4 weeks were approaching, they were saying, well, you know what? It's not just 5 databases. It's actually 74 databases. And by the way, there's some processes here going on that you should be aware of. For instance, do you know that some people are reading this data into a SQL Server database? And they said, well, that should not be happening. So, so they basically said, well, give us that metadata. And then they said, and also there's some Cognos reporting here. So they said, yep, give us that metadata too. And we're able to come back and say, the answer you had, not only were we able to do it faster, but the answer you had wasn't right. And there's really a lot more going on here. One of the learnings was some of the data that had been extracted out into SQL Server was the people wanted to do some SAS reporting, but in the end, it was too slow on SQL Server, so they took some of that data and copied it back into Teradata to run the SAS reporting. So, one of the benefits of this learning is not just compliance with GDPR, but they're able to say, well, we can eliminate that process, go straight into, the SAS reporting directly off the core warehouse bit, and, save some extraction and some processes that are going on. So, you're taking some load off the system, and you're eliminating some redundant processes. So at the end of this, they were extremely impressed. So this program, you can start with just an assessment, but often what will happen is the result of the assessment will go into some ongoing remediation. That will go into 2 to 6 month processes of continuing to look at the data, add new subject areas potentially, look at points of getting rid of redundant data, maybe feeding into other processes like some encryption and other processes. So that requires some output for some reports. And then the ongoing monitoring process, which just says getting regular ingestions of new metadata that's coming in, change metadata, and updating all of the current dashboards. So this is the Gantt chart view of the process, and you'll see that you'll start with, in that initial 40 days, for covering your high-risk areas, and then you might have sprints later to start looking at some of the other subject areas that are potentially lower risk, the remediation process. You see all along the way interaction with potentially the legal groups, and so right away, and really at the end of the first 40-day, 30 or 40-day effort, you're right into remediation of the high-risk areas, and then you're continuing to look at the lower-risk areas, and then potentially then if you go for the monitoring service, then you're going to continue to monitor the high-risk areas, and then all the other subject areas you add over time, and then it just becomes a program kind of that runs in the background that it's for ongoing process. So who's doing this? Well, back in June when this was originally presented, you can see that even though it was a brand new program, there were already huge companies that were involved in using the service. They were already very far down the line for getting their initial documents produced, remediation of some of the results. You can see, telcos, you could see banks, and this slide was even outdated then, and this was, as I said, originally presented back in June, and now I'm recording this at the end of August. So this has moved on, and there's already more customers, and people are further along on the line. So as I mentioned, this is a fixed bid engagement, so you can get started. They've been doing this enough now that they're very comfortable that at the end of the 30 days, you're going to have a high-value output. Then they leave it for another 30 days so you can evaluate the solution, see how it came out, see if it meets your needs, and then at that point decide, are you going to go in? Are you going to start looking at other, the next area 2, area 3, area 4, and then potentially after that go on to ongoing maintenance. Now, as part of these charges, you're essentially renting the software from Teradata and the other companies involved, like Magnitude. So, for instance, it's providing the temporary license for our data warehouse automation solution, where this data is flowing into, and so it's all included as part of this fixed bid. Now we're going to start looking at some of the actual screenshots and reports involved, and so you see in this case, the items in blue are tables or views, and the green boxes are processes that are moving that data around. And they track the personal data at a column level. So, and this is the example we talked about before, where if it sees some PII data and there's a process that moves it around, even if it gets renamed to something else, that it knows that this resulting column is also PII based on an inference. Because it knows that, hey, if it was PII there, then it's going to still be PII no matter what it's named when it gets landed somewhere else. Now, this particular project had used Protegrity, and essentially, these screens can get quite complex, right? I mean, in a huge bank where you're moving data from operational systems and a lot of different. Landing it in data warehouses and potentially data marts. And so in this case, they wanted to see which fields do we need to encrypt or anonymize in the system. But essentially what that is, having to decide, what changes need to be made. And this gives you a nice report of saying, this is all the places, this is the impact that changing a given column will be. This slide shows you how some of the dashboards and how some of the information can be grouped. And this is also an MDM use case where you might decide, I need to have a grouping of maybe the types of people that are looking at this, so I can try to find outliers. So, for instance, if somebody is looking, they're in the customer services group and they're looking at PII, that might be right. They might need to do that as part of their job, but maybe if I see somebody in a group that isn't in the customer service, I need to evaluate more. Why is that person looking at that particular type of data? Here's just another example of a click dashboard that has, basically all this information ingested and allowing you to go through and look at this from a user standpoint or a database level standpoint of, how many queries are running, how many tables, how many columns, which ones have PII, and what are the subject areas that have a lot, most of this information. And you can just navigate around this like in any click document. And that's it. If you'd like more information about this program, we can definitely put you in touch with the right people from Teradata to get you more information. You could also go to our website. So if you go to the Magnitude website and you click on Solutions and then GDPR Compliance, that will bring up some more information. And if you click on the Pricing and Info, Contact Us, and you fill in your name, it will send us the information, and we will put you in touch with the person at Teradata that needs to get this information, and we can go from there. Thank you very much.